There's a growing belief amongst well-placed sources that this could be Pep Guardiola's last season at Manchester City. But why? What does this mean for the team and who could be replacing him? Well, let's get into it with John Mackenzie and JJ Bull. Well, let's just clarify this. Pep Guardiola's contract at Manchester City runs until June 2027. But as David Ornstein explained in December, they are looking at potential replacements. So while City are still very much in the title race, some of their results recently haven't represented the City that we know. They've had draws where they should have won it. Could you explain why that is?
Well, I think the thing that we associate with Pep Guardiola is control, often possession control. So his teams have the ability to actually take the ball and use it in such a way that it makes it harder for opponents to actually do anything with it. And possession control is great for two reasons. One is the more of the ball you have, the more opportunities you should have to generate chances. But obviously it's also a zero-sum game, right, with the opponent. So if you have more of the ball, they have less of the ball. That means they're going to have less opportunities to be able to try and score goals as well. And I think what we've started to see in the last couple of seasons is that it's becoming harder and harder to control games in that way. And I think a nice way of explaining this and showing you how it's actually happening on the pitch is to go back to their game against Spurs at the weekend. Because what we saw in that game was very much, the old cliche, a game of two halves. But in the first half, we saw City being able to play the game in a way where they're able to control the game, mainly through possession. And in the second half, things changed. So let's just talk through that now. So in that game, Spurs played with a back five. So I've shown the back five here on the screen. It's actually quite a passive back five. And what I mean by that is that in the modern game, when you have five players at the back, you don't want to waste players.
Got it.
So you're going to try and get players stepping up to help out where they can. And in this instance, what we have from Spurs is actually they're going to do that particularly with their wing backs here. So you've got two wing backs on either side who are going to be ready to jump up onto the Man City fullbacks when they need to. But when the ball's in the middle, then those two wing backs aren't going to jump, which means actually you end up with quite a passive back five in those sorts of situations. And the reality is that you've got two Manchester City players against five Spurs players. Now, in that situation, you're massively overloading against their players. That means they're going to be massively overloading against you somewhere else on the pitch. So if we draw the line in between the back five and then Spurs' pressing units, you can see that there's five Spurs players against 8 City players further up the pitch. Now, for a team who are trying to control games through possession, that kind of equation is quite nice for them. They're probably going to come out on top. They're probably going to be able to keep the ball relatively well. But possession control isn't enough. As we said, you have to try and generate chances with the ball as well. And this was another area where City were able to generate threat in this game. It was very easy for them to move the ball through the lines and generate situations that were quite dangerous, particularly in the first half. So let's just talk about what Spurs are doing in their pressing unit further up the pitch. So what we've got here is a very narrow front three, and their job is to basically block off passing lanes into the middle. And then behind them, you've got two midfielders here who are largely man-to-man against their opponents. So you can see here, this is Conor Gallagher. And when Nico O'Reilly is stepping out, you can see Gallagher chasing him. We've got deeper here, Basuma, and he's keeping an eye on Ryan Cherki here. So that's all well and good. But the problem is that when you bring those two things together, where you've got largely zonal front line who are trying to block passing lanes, and then maybe more man-oriented players deeper in the field, then you can manipulate those and create really nice conditions to actually find free players between the lines. So what happens in this situation here is we've got Bernardo Silva outside of the block. What he's going to do is he's going to run inside the block when Nico O'Reilly drops out, dragging his player with him. And what we've got now is a situation where Bernardo Silva is in a lot of space. Rodri can play the ball through the lines to him. And now you end up with a series of, it's almost like dominoes. Everything collapses down. Nico O'Reilly then attacks the space. The ball can go to him. And now you can see they're in a really dangerous situation between the lines with lots of passing options to get in behind that back line. This is exactly what City want to do. They want to generate threat by getting free players between the lines, finding them, and then generating these attacking moments. But when we're talking about Pep Guardiola wanting to control games, it's not just about wanting to control possession, not just about wanting to generate threat with that possession, but it's also about mitigating the issues that can exist if you lose the ball. And again, we come back to this overload that we've been talking about, this essentially 8v5 in City's favour, where actually if Spurs do lose the ball, they're under a lot of pressure, they want to just play the ball out to get rid of it and take the pressure off, then they're playing it into this overload where City are going to find it very easy to recycle and reset. And so the reason why City was so dominant in that first half is because Spurs were doing everything to play into their hands. City could control in every phase of play as they like to. Now, obviously, in the second half, things were going to have to change because Thomas Frank wasn't going to be able to actually continue playing in this way because they were just getting cut through a lot. And, you know, had City been 5 years ago City, they probably would have scored maybe 3-4 goals in that first half. Now, actually, in the event, Romero went off. He was ill going into the game and they decided to remove him in the second half. And essentially what they did is rather than having this back five with lots of passive players, they said, we've got to start taking the game to City a little bit more. So essentially what happened was Romero came off and they brought on Pat Matasar. They went to a back four, and now what they're doing is they're starting to add more players into that mix to make it harder for City to possess the ball and make it harder for them to control in the way that they're doing. Equalise this relationship a little bit more. You can have your fullbacks going a little bit more aggressive, and then suddenly you're starting to look a lot more matched in the middle of the field. Now, that's not to say that there weren't still the same kind of issues that were existing, because they still played with like now a 4 instead of a 3. And they're still trying to block passing lanes, and there were some situations where City was still able to find those gaps between the lines. But the big thing for me is that now Spurs were thinking a little bit more about what happened when they got the ball and went long. What they'd been doing in the first half in situations where they had the ball, they were basically rolling one of the wing backs forward, so they're almost like a winger, and shifting to a back four like this. They've got the 2 midfielders deep here to help out and build up. And what they're going to try and do is move the ball around the back line until they find a situation where they can essentially play it into one of the forwards. And so let's compare the first half with the second half in these sorts of situations to see the difference, because this is in the first half. You spread your back line out, you've got your 2 centre midfielders deep, and you've got your forwards all spread out. And what you're going to try and do is find your forwards in some way. But your forwards are so isolated man-to-man that if you're not winning those duels, you've got no one around them, the odds are that City are going to win the ball back, recycle it, and then they're going to have control again. But when we look at what happens in the second half, we can see it's a very, very different picture, because now what you've done is you've got, rather than wing-backs, you've got full-backs, you've got extra players in the middle, you're pushing your full-backs a little bit higher, so you're adding support to win those balls. But that means that you can now contract your forward players into a very small space. So now in those moments where you're going to go long, to try and find your forwards, you're putting them into a scenario where that you've got a much better chance of winning those second balls. So Spurs basically went from playing into City's hands in the first half to playing in a way where they were actually putting them under much more pressure. They were going long a lot more. They were happy to go long into these situations when they were struggling to build out. And as a result, City were now in the sort of situations that we've seen over the last couple of seasons where they struggled to compete physically, and Spurs were able to get back into the game. So I thought this was a really interesting example of the problems that City have been having recently, where if you give them time and space, you allow them to generate overloads, you play in a zonal way rather than going man-to-man, then they will just cut through you, and eventually they will score. But if you say, we're not going to play the game on your terms, we're going to play much more physically, we're going to go man-to-man more, we're going to play direct into your defenders, so you're doing a lot of backwards defending, then they suddenly look a lot more vulnerable. So I think this is really interesting going into the question of what is the future going to look like for City, because it almost feels as though they need a coach who has a different approach, who is able to, I think the phrase that the Spanish coaches use is to suffer. There's going to be long periods of games now, I think, for teams at every level of the game, where they have to be able to deal with things out of possession as well as in possession as well. They have to be able to control in different ways. So yeah, I think that's where we're going to go forward, looking for a City coach who is maybe going to have a bit more of a diverse approach to control than relying on possessional control.
Yeah, we'll discuss who that potential next coach could actually be a little later on. And also a quick shout out to Dominic Solanke for that little scorpion kick. Beautiful. Right, let's talk about Guardiola some more, because look, JJ, when he joined the league, 10 years ago, very different Premier League to where we are right now. Could you just give us a sense of the evolution and what's changed?
Well, yeah, I think one of the big problems that Guardiola has created is of his own making. So everyone else has kind of caught up with what he does. And so he's finding the problems like John's explaining there. And we can bring it all back to the great Tony Pulis, who said...
Pulis? I didn't think this was coming into it.
He says, Pep's style of play did not just become the right way to play, it also became the only way. So everyone's catching up with Guardiola, they're learning from him and doing things that he does. Guardiola has massively influenced the Premier League, and my hypothesis is that his influence is so massive is that he has raised the level of everyone else, and now the ways he used to dominate games don't work in the same way. You can kind of track it by some of Guardiola's signings, but not the ones you might think.
Okay.
Not like De Bruyne or anything like that. No, the goalkeepers. The first goalkeeper he signed was Claudio Bravo. Remember that? Joe Hart went out. Everyone was like, you can't do that. But they could, and now everyone wants to have a ball-playing goalkeeper so you can play out from the back. But that wasn't enough. What you needed to do is be able to play out over the press. And so Ederson came in, which means you could then play long if you want to. You've got options. You can draw teams out and go long. Players want that. Not everyone's got that in their locker. And then the most recent goalkeeper change, Ederson's gone. In comes Gianluigi Donnarumma.
Very different.
Very different, but more better, I would say.
It's not a way of putting it, yeah.
Dealing with lots of out-of-possession stuff. Donnarumma is amazing at shot stopping, so that's what you get. And those are 3 key signings along the way of the Guardiola timeline. So he's gone very much to not a Guardiola goalkeeper. It's kind of odd. But you can see Guardiola's influence on the entire league by looking at some of the data from when he joined. He joined in 2016-17. He was called a fraud. They said it couldn't work. And after a long decline, long passes have started to make a comeback, a very small comeback in the Premier League. But if you look at this is not my stock portfolio. This is the Premier League long passes. They have declined. So 2016-17 is exactly where I've got my little pencil over here. It goes all the way down, right down to now. It's starting to come up a little bit. Maybe we're seeing a reversal here. We look at aerial duels per game. That's what you think of in England, long balls, aerial duels.
Very Pulis.
Yeah, they have gone down completely since Guardiola came in. Keep the ball on the deck, so more passes in your own half, lots of build-up, less of this. What you also see is in how teams are really trying to score their goals. So in 2016-17, 40.8% of shots total in the Premier League were from outside of the box. And in 25-26, it's 31.9, which, as you'll know, is less.
It's less.
It's less.
Great maths.
Yeah, and but weirdly, goals outside the box are a slightly higher percentage now than they were then. Maybe they're getting better at it.
You could also make the argument, I suppose, that they're choosing to shoot outside the box in better situations than they were as well, right? It's like, we always talk about XG as though it's like, don't shoot outside the box, try and get the ball into better scenarios in the box.
Yeah.
Whereas it could also just be that they're like, well, these are the areas where you should be able to shoot from distance and it might come off for you. So they're doing that a bit more as well.
Yeah, I want to get more into it. I haven't got it here, but I wonder whether it is more like Morgan Rogers shooting from 20 yards rather than Matt Taylor shooting from 40.
Yeah, that's true.
Don't know if that's what's changed. But this is the thing. So there's more differences, right? So as Guardiola's come in and it's all the in-possession stuff, out-of-possession has totally changed as well. So like now you can see this is the steady increase in start distance in the Premier League. So that's how far upfield in metres from the opponent's goal line a team initiates their open play sequences. So it's gone right up. High turnovers also went massively up when Guardiola joined. And again, Klopp's been there as well, so it's probably linked to that as well. Interestingly, that is starting to decline now as well. I don't know whether you have an idea as to why that might be.
Well, I think that around the 2020s, teams start doing a lot more of trying to get into man-to-man phases. And at that point in time, opponents are still trying to build up from the back, right? Yeah. So you're much more likely to end up with these turnovers of the ball. But what we've started seeing, you mentioned Ederson before, teams are much happier just going over the press, right? And we've started seeing play styles where teams will sit deep, try and bait the opponent forward, and then play over the top into more favourable situations, and clearly that's happening now. Press has got so good that it became pointless trying to play through them, so we just play over them, right?
Yeah, and the other thing, I don't know if this is related to that exactly, but what we also seen is a massive decrease in open play goals. Football has got worse in the Premier League.
Some might say less exciting.
Well, maybe, but we'll not go into that. But open play have gone down, which of course means goals and set pieces have massively gone up. Because the thing is, what teams seem to have worked out is that you don't try and copy Guardiola to beat him. You just do the other thing. There's other like caveats we can look at here, right? So everyone else in that same time frame, like 16, 17, everyone else got smarter and like made better recruitment. I think that's the main thing.
The recruitment's huge.
Bournemouth's recruitment is unbelievable. Brighton's obviously there. You get teams now with tiny budgets who are competing at the very top. There's not so much of a skill gap as ever there was, I'd say, and probably a financial gap as well. Players like De Bruyne have gone, Rodri's been injured, and they never really replaced Mahrez. Maybe Semenyo can be that kind of player, but they had star players who could, what they used to do was dominate games, and you could afford to dominate games because you could open up the moment of magic by someone like Mahrez or De Bruyne.
De Bruyne.
Exactly, so they don't really have those players. I would say maybe now Cherki might be it going forward. It's a bit of a change in the squad build-up, and Guardiola's dealing with that for maybe the first time. He's added players before, but this is a whole rebuild, really. And on that note, like they've won everything, a lot of these players. Maybe they're being shipped out now, so he's changing what the motivation is. Like, do they still have the same motivation to to prove that they can get to the top now. They've already done it. It's a different kind of motivation, and very few people, like Sir Alex Ferguson's probably the best example I can think of, for Ancelotti can constantly get players into that. But also, like, he had Jurgen Klopp as his nemesis all the way through, who was playing not entirely dissimilarly, like Preston Howell and stuff, but now his arch rival, he's built his own lab monster. And Mikel Arteta is
the pupil has now become the master.
Yeah, and everyone, I would say, is that unfair to say a lot of teams are now kind of doing what Arsenal are doing, like they're focusing on the small things, set pieces, which brings us back to our Lord and Saviour Tony Pulis.
Oh, we've gone full circle.
Because like, he said in that same BBC column that I got that quote from, is that he's talking about, he always thought the idea is not to try and play like Guardiola. The idea is to try and find strengths and maximise things in other areas. And so that's where you'd get Stoke were amazing at long throws, set pieces, because they had that. And so what I think we've seen with Guardiola is that he's still like the greatest manager probably of all time, the most influential probably, maybe of all time, certainly of our era. The way to beat him is not to copy him. It's to do what other teams are doing. You focus on set pieces, you become really hard to beat, you go man to man, you get really strong lads in, so that defeats the way he wants to try and play around it. And remember, like Guardiola back in, 2016, they lost to Leicester 4-2, and everyone's like, you're a fraud. And he says, I'm not a coach for the tackles. He's kind of laughing as he said it. It's another aspect of football, but in the end, we're not going to win or lose for the tackles. And he was asked about this once he'd won the league with 100 points, proving he's not a fraud, in 2018.
Can you imagine, like, thinking that guy's a fraud considering what he did at Barcelona, Bayern Munich?
But people are always
insane,
to bring them down, aren't they? That's the thing. And see, like, so he was asked about this. This is in the Guardian. I read this, but it was everywhere. He was saying it. Of course, it's necessary to win tackles. Tackling is a part of the game. People think it's just pass the ball, possession of the ball. No. That is cultural, because the way we play in England is with more physicality and more long balls, which suggests and creates these kinds of actions. It's important. So we've kind of gone, like, he was aware of it then, he had to change things to get into it. Everyone's then copied him, so he's not dealing with the same problem, back to now, where he's dealing with an even worse version of the original problem that he once defeated.
I think it's really interesting that you bring this up, because essentially what we were talking about in the Spurs game is, in the first half, City were able to create free players, right? And that's the basis of positional play. That's the style that Guardiola uses. And the idea is that you create these players in space. You use overloads to be able to play the ball through the lines and generate advantages there. If you shift to man marking, then in theory, unless you can, lose your marker, there should be no free players, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. And the game then becomes about duels, right? Because you're one-to-one against everyone across the pitch. And this reminds me of a quote that I read from Guardiola after a game that they played against Arsenal in 2014. I say they, I mean Bayern Munich. He was at Bayern Munich at that time. And essentially what happens in that game is that Guardiola is talking about how they're trying to create these advantages by having an extra player around the Arsenal pivot player so they can create a free player, as we're talking about here. And he said that his team just weren't doing that well enough. So Arsenal were able to just go one-to-one across the pitch. And he was like, just resolves down into 1v1 matchups. And that, when you have good players like Arjen Robben or Frank Ribery, that's a good thing in principle. But he wants to generate even more advantages by having those overloads. And he's saying we can't do it when these 1v1 matchups happen. This is in 2014, and we fast forward, 12 years to now. And that's what's happening now. Teams are forcing 1v1 matchups all over the pitch, so his teams can't generate free players and get all of the benefits that they get from that.
Okay, well, let's move on to potential replacements if Guardiola does intend to leave Manchester City. I'm going to throw a few names at you now, gentlemen. You just tell me how well a fit you think there will be for Manchester City potentially. So, JJ, let's start with the top man on the list, Enzo Maresca.
He knows Guardiola well. He's worked with him. He plays very similar football. I have a graphic here which shows the Man City's and Chelsea's shapes in the 24-25 season were basically exactly the same. Now, shape's not everything. Everyone can play a 4-4-2 or a 4-3-3, but they also are stylistically very, very similar. He's basically a different version of Guardiola. He's learned from him. He thinks he's a genius. He is very similar. The holdbacks on Maresca is that he hasn't ever really had a job for that long because things like Leicester he left, and then you saw that he didn't agree with everything that was happening at Chelsea, and then that sort of fell apart as well. So you might wonder whether he's a great coach, is he a great manager, is he what you want for long term? Maybe he'd be a great post Guardiola appointment because there wouldn't be too much of a difference tactically. Okay. And then because after any dynasty, if like Wenger leaves or Klopp leaves, you think you'd have a drop. So that's maybe a good way to manage it. It would be something like Maresca.
Okay. What about another one? Former disciple of Pep Guardiola, as a player, not a coach, of course, Vincent Kompany, who's currently at Bayern Munich.
Kompany's an interesting one, obviously doing really well at Bayern at the moment, although interestingly enough, they have started dropping
They've dropped a few points recently.
Yeah, we've actually just put out a video on our channel looking at why that might be the case, and very interesting because Kompany's lent into this man-to-man across the pitch, very stringent, and teams are now starting to figure out ways of causing it problems. And so, yeah, you're giving, I think, a little bit of an easy advantage for weaker teams to be able to try and exploit that. Which I guess raises my question with Kompany, whether or not this is too early in the cycle for him. I suspect he probably wants to spend more time at Bayern to develop as a coach. Like, this is his first elite club, so he probably wants to win the league this season, obviously, but maybe he wants to do what Guardiola did and spend 3 years there, try and win the Champions League and try and get deep in the Champions League. So I guess that would be good for him in terms of, as JJ's just mentioned, when a dynastic coach leaves, then that you can expect maybe there is a drop off. Maybe he won't want to risk being the coach after the hero, but also gives him time to develop and maybe fix some of these out of possession problems that we're seeing. Just develop as a coach longer term. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, but maybe the timing is just not quite right.
Okay, is the timing right for Xabi Alonso?
He's available because it didn't work at Real Madrid for him. Or did it work at Real Madrid for him?
It could have. Who knows? Was he allowed to? Who knows?
Well, that's it. He tried to make them press high up the pitch, right? But there are many eyes in Real Madrid's team. And that's a part of the problem, right? So they did, like, their pressing numbers went really high up. I've got a graphic here that shows that they're winning the ball high up the pitch far more often than Alonso. That's what happened. But towards the end, when people started falling out with him, maybe, it started to decline. So whether he lost his influence on them or whether they just thought, boy, I can't be bothered chasing these boys around anymore, But Real Madrid were actually, the underlying numbers were amazing.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, he's one of the most successful win percentages of any recent Real Madrid coach. His expected goal difference per game in the Liga was the best of any team. But then there's a difference between being a good coach and being a good manager. And so Real Madrid players probably don't need coached. They want to be managed, and you rely on the individual strengths of them. So if you have players that are as good as Real Madrid's, often you don't need to put them into these structures. But the theory is that that's what you need to do to win, like Guardiola did for so long. That's what you need to coach for. But if football is now not that, especially in the Premier League, is that what you want? So I'm not really sure. And I think if if Alonso were to go there after Pep and then it didn't really work for him very well, it would be, I don't know how many huge jobs he would get again after that, because it didn't work at Real Madrid, it didn't work at Man City. But equally, he could go in there and be unbelievably amazing. The one thing is that you'd think, from a nice romantic point of view, he'd probably want to work at Liverpool. If you go to Man City, can you go to Liverpool afterwards? I don't know.
Don't think you can. Not sure. Anyway, let's move on to the man, the myth, the legend, Roberto De Zerbi.
Yeah, Roberto De Zerbi is a really interesting one because in many respects he follows in the same lineage of positional play that Guardiola is operating within. And I think you can make the argument that in recent years, Guardiola has started using a lot more of De Zerbi's ideas. So at least in terms of the continuity there, you've maybe got the same sorts of principles being coached. But I also think that De Zerbi almost flips Guardiola's approach on its head, because what we talked about with Guardiola is controlling the ball through possession, but what that often looked like was trying to develop what you might call a territorial advantage, which is you want to squeeze the opponent really hard up the pitch, keep them penned into their own penalty box. You're making a low block that's hard to break down, but you're also keeping the opponent a very long way away from your goal. And part of the reason why I think Guardiola's approach is maybe aging out is because teams are finding solutions to those kind of problems. But what we get with De Zerbi is a very different approach to that. And essentially what De Zerbi does is he goes back to the old logics, which they say when you're defending, you make space small. When you're attacking, you make space big. And as we've just said, Guardiola's sort of flipping that on his head and saying when we're attacking on the ball, we're creating less space because we're creating low blocks that we're then going to try and break down. And in doing so, we're opening up a lot of space behind us that can be attacked. De Zerbi is like, well, let's go back to the old way and just try and make the spaces that we're attacking much bigger, because if we do that, it'll be easier for us to score. The way that he does that is quite different from the old logic, because in the old logic, you did that by basically sitting in deep, low blocking, and then countering when you won the ball back, which is quite risky because if you don't ever get the ball back, so you're not having very many attacking opportunities, and also you're giving the opponent the initiative. So you're basically saying, break us down, and if you don't, we'll get a go at goal, which should result in a bigger chance. De Zerbi was like, why don't we just do that with the ball? So essentially what he does is he takes the Guardiola logic and says, rather than trying to possess the ball up here near the opponent's box, we're going to possess it deep near our own box, and we're going to invite the opponent to come out and press us, and then we're going to use positional ideas as an escape mechanism to get through this pressure. And if you can do that well enough and you bait the opponents in, you can have your own players dropping into the space between the lines that are opened out, and suddenly you're generating these more transitional moments. We call them artificial transitions because we've generated them through ball possession rather than having to win the ball to do that. So there's an argument to be made that, this is a slightly different approach to what City are doing, and it's certainly the way that teams are playing now. If we went back to that Spurs screenshot that we had showing you what they were doing in the first half, they were doing this, right? They had a wide back four, a double pivot in front of them to try and help them possess the ball, and then 4 players pushed up against the back line, creating space that can then be attacked. This is what a lot of clubs are doing now, so maybe De Zerbi would be attractive from that kind of point of view. However, there are, he is quite a passionate guy. De Zerbi, he has fallen out with boards a lot of times.
As has Maresca as well.
And players, So it may be the case that potentially this is considered to be too risky an option. And as I've said, there's lots of coaches now doing this, so maybe they would go down a sort of De Zerbi adjacent route. But yeah, he's definitely a possibility.
Okay, this next one's a little left field, but I think there might be a little bit of logic to this one. Cesc Fabregas at Como.
Well, he feels like a Guardiola because he's also from La Masia. He's played for Guardiola.
Yeah. There's something in there.
Oh, he's played for some excellent managers, and also we know who Cesc Fabregas is, and he seems like an entertaining idea to bring him back home to the Premier League, as you'd think. But he's done really well with Como, he has a more than vested interest in.
I mean, he's got a bit of money in it.
Well, exactly, right? So then, when you look at what they've done, so I think they're 6th in Serie A at the time we're speaking, something like that, but he's taken them up, he's done really well.
I think
with
they beat
them.
Juventus this season, which is incredible.
Yeah, but they've made good signings, they have good players in them. I see a lot of Guardiola stuff, I see a lot of De Zerbi stuff in what they do. I even see a lot of Reggie Lebris.
Oh, wow.
They do a lot of things where they empty the middle, and then you get one player who'll drop in to receive and build up and things like that. But it doesn't really matter the tactical ideas that you have, because I think all these managers, it's very likely their teams would look quite similar to a Guardiola team if they were to take over. I think with Fabregas, again, it's very early in his career. Would it be too big a jump to go to Man City? I don't know. I think Fabregas is maybe too early because we've seen him at Como. We haven't seen him go to a different club where the expectations are higher and the pressure is higher. I think Man City is a bit of an anomaly in that regard because it's not. It just feels slightly different to some of the other clubs.
Okay, and finally, the likelihood of this one happening, I'm just going to say it's very slim. But we've got to put the question: Mikel Arteta, the apprentice, now semi-master,
the nemesis.
The nemesis, yeah.
Well, and that's exactly why we're mentioning this, right? Not because it's likely to happen, but because, in many respects, Arteta is the next obvious evolution of the Guardiola play style. We talked about at the beginning, Guardiola being someone who's trying to control the game through possession primarily. Obviously, he cares about controlling the game without the ball when he doesn't have it. And, back in 22-23, Man City were probably the best out-of-possession team in the world. So it's unfair to just characterise him as only doing out-of-possession. But I think what you get with Arteta is a realisation that actually the situations that Guardiola teams want to try and create, as we said, creating a lot of space in behind that can be exploited if teams win the ball back. I think Arteta realised that was the weakness to that approach. And so what he's done is he's built a team that can mitigate that problem and has leaned into physicality and has recognised, okay, well, leaning into physicality may result in a reduction of open play chance creation, but actually we're going to make that up in set pieces. I was looking at the numbers the other day. You can see very clearly the point in time that, that the season after City win the treble and Arsenal drop those points at the end, and then they buy Declan Rice, Kai Havertz in the summer. You can see an obvious reduction in the amount of open play expected goals that they're creating, but they bump it up with set piece play. That's why this is so interesting. It's kind of like, well, if Arteta's basically solved the problems, surely he should be considered as a potential for fixing Manchester City. I think the problem is that you compare the squads of Arsenal with the squad of Manchester City, and it's very clear that would require a complete rebuild of that Manchester City squad. So yeah, I think it would be, he's not going to go into a squad that's necessarily perfect for what he wants to do. And as we saw, it took him 3-4 years before he had a squad that could do the things that he wanted to do. So that would be a longer term option, be a riskier option, and it would also involve Arteta going from a project where he's so close to hitting the levels that he wanted to hit that I suspect he probably wouldn't be that interested. But you never know if they win the league. If they win, there's still 4 competitions they're in.
Yeah.
If
they won a chunk of those competitions,
yeah,
then maybe
cheers, John.
my work here is done.
Lovely. He ain't going.
What's Jose Mourinho up to?
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football